Hello and welcome to Debating Europe's online town hall style citizens panel on climate change. My name is Joe Littbarski and I'm the editor of Debating Europe. And for the next 20 to 30 minutes, we have with us Francesca Brandner, a German Green politician who's currently a member of the Bundestag and who was formerly a member of the European Parliament from 2009 to 2013. Hello, Francesca.
Hi.
Hello, thank you for joining us. As we record this on Thursday, the 10th of December, EU leaders are meeting in Brussels, and one of the topics on the agenda will be whether to introduce a new carbon emissions reduction target of at least 55% by 2030. However, some member states, such as Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, argue that they would be disproportionately hit by the targets because their economies are, for example, heavily reliant on coal. Meanwhile, the world's largest CO2 emitter, China, has vowed to go climate neutral by 2060, and an incoming Biden administration in the US raises hopes that America will once again prioritize the climate. So where does all of this leave Europe? The EU likes to see itself as a leader in the fight against climate change, but do all European countries agree on the direction of travel? Now, the idea behind our citizens panels is that it's not me asking the questions to Francesca, but rather our panelists, our panel of European citizens who are joining us virtually. So as I said, we've got maybe 20 or 30 minutes, which isn't so long. I'd like to dive straight into the questions then from citizens. So we're going to start from Ricardo, who has a question. If you could introduce yourself, Ricardo, and ask your question.
Thank you. So my name is Ricardo Silva. I'm Portuguese. I currently reside in Berlin. Not super relevant, but what is it? Half my days are spent being an open innovation consultant, and the other half is spent doing things like the poster I have in my back, which is basically climate activism. And to go, the question that I posed when I saw the topic was a very simple one. If we talk about Europe being in the lead of climate action, then you look to the main program that's been put forward, the European Green Deal. And when you look at the European Green Deal, the first thing that you see is that it's very put into, how to put it, Europe wants to be the leader in climate action meaning sustainable green action and economic growth. So essentially completely subscribing to the concept of green growth is possible. And as I would imagine that this is becoming more mainstream, is this really passive of being called of being in the lead, of still thinking that green growth is possible when most research points otherwise? And so, not knowing exactly what your opinion or stance is on this, I would say that if you think the answer is a little bit obvious, then I would say, okay, so what's the strategy here? How can we revert this kind of development, which is frankly quite disturbing? And yeah, sorry for making a super long question. I hope it provides plenty of context.
I try to be short in my answer. So you're asking about growth, and if there's the option of decoupling growth from using the resources we have on this planet. And I think, yes, it all depends on how you define growth. We as Greens, we have developed our own indicator of well-being. So it has ecological aspects, but also social. For us, it's also important to have the social dimension in there, so that if you're sick, so far it increases the GDP, which is a bit absurd. So it has the two dimensions, the social and the environmental one. And it's the sort of our German green well-being indicator. We do it year by year. It's our alternative report. So that's the way we approach it. Because certainly there are sectors that need to decrease, to degrow. And there are others where we need to grow, like solar panels. We need to have more. We need to have more windmills. So there we need to grow in terms of having more. So for us, it's not a question about yes or no. It's a question of how you define growth, ecologically and socially. And then to set the incentives right for the sectors that need to degrow to perish, and others to grow.
Is that clear, Ricardo? Do you have a kind of follow-up question, or are you happy with that?
I think that's a very interesting answer. And I don't want to overextend my time, but my follow-up question, if allowed, would really be, how do you think that politically this is achievable? Essentially, I mean, using very poor words, switching the indicators, the KPIs, the key performance indicators for the economy in this case. Do you think this is politically achievable, and how? Sorry.
And can I know I said I wouldn't jump in, but I want to kind of add, I think it's a really interesting question, Ricardo. Can I also maybe add in the context of the pandemic, when we are looking at very, very heavy pressures on the environment, high unemployment potentially, and this real pressure on prioritizing economic recovery?
I first answer Ricardo's question and then yours, okay? Is that possible? Yes, it is. There are some countries in the world, by the way, who are already going this way, who are defining it. And how GDP is measured has been changed many times in history. So it's not something that we have inherited from God and here it stands, but it's something that evolves. So yes, I totally believe that you can redefine it. And you start, already by taking away all the subsidies we still have for fossil, for example, in the German budget, in the EU budget. So there are concrete steps that you can take. And to your question, Joe, does the pandemic help or not? Yes, I think it helps. We today had a debate in the Bundestag about health. And it was quite remarkable that everybody said, the way we looked at health and how we monitorized it in the past was obviously wrong. And that we pay a price today for it, for having rationalized and the way we counted health. So I think actually that there is opening to redefine on what is efficient, what is the way how we define well-being. And actually, yes, it opens opportunities. Of course, there's heavy pressure to sustain the economy right now. And it will be important, as the United Nations said, build back better. And it's not happening everywhere, but that's what we're fighting for.
Okay, let's move on to the question from Malta then. Apologies if I mispronounced that. Malta, do you want to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. No, it was perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you for the chance to take part in this debate. My name is Malte. I'm from Germany. I live in Braunschweig in Germany, and I'm a PhD student working on life cycle assessment, so about assessing environmental impacts. My question is about the EU ETS, so the emission trading scheme. And I think most of us are probably aware of it. So it's just a cap and trade system for carbon emissions as an alternative to, for example, carbon taxes. And I basically have kind of like three sub-questions, I'd say. The first one is regarding the level, the price of the ETS. So I think we can all agree it's too low right now, between maybe 20 and 30 euros. It's been close to zero in the past, then some adjustments have been made. The second thing is that it only covers roughly 40% of greenhouse gases in the European sector. And the third one is it only covers obviously Europe and not outside of Europe. So there's a topic of maybe some carbon leakage to outside and also how to get more international agreements. So maybe starting with the first sub-question, how could we get the price up from 20 to 30 to something where scientists think it's more effective, maybe 100 or even more euros per ton of CO2?
Sorry, I hit the wrong button by unmuting myself. Thank you for the question. Let me start by saying, if you want to go for a carbon neutral society, you need different approaches. One is pricing, putting a price on CO2. Another one is investing in new technologies, so giving money, not taking money. And you can combine these. And then there's a third one, to set legal frameworks, okay? For example, there have been many dangerous elements in industry, chemistry that we do forbid now in toys. The chemicals, ingredients that we say they're not allowed to be in toys. We don't put a price on them. We say they're not allowed. Okay, so And that's important because you need to have in mind that whenever you go via the pricing system, it inherently has a social impact. Yeah, because pricing is structurally socially unjust, because poorer people always are more concerned when prices increase than rich people. Yeah, so that's why you really have to think hard. Where do you go via pricing, or where do you set a legal framework, or where do you go via investment? Yeah, so that I think it's important to have as a framework. So you can't do everything via the pricing mechanism because it would be socially unjust. And that's what I said in Ricardo's response. We really want to combine climate neutrality with social justice. So to your question, is the price too low? Yes, certainly way too low. So we need to reform it. And there will be a proposal for reform by the European Commission next year. And I think it will be a tough battle to increase the price. And it will be, hard to increase it, but I think hopefully we will achieve. The coverage, which sectors do we include? There's a very lively debate about, transport and housing, which are, for example, so far not included. On housing, there's a very interesting debate on what do you need to include so that it doesn't become socially unjust? And where do you need to go via a legal framework? And I think it's a very fair debate, and it will be interesting to see what the European Commission comes up with and proposes. But certainly we need to have more on transport. Like already you can do it a lot via taxes, like you tax kerosene. So even if you don't do it within the ETS, you can have an increase of the price in the transport sector. And then the third question was, so what happens if we make it more expensive and then our companies go bust and then we import the dirty steel from China? That doesn't help the climate at all. It just destroys our companies and our jobs. So that's a very fair point. That's why we have been advocating for a so-called border adjustment mechanism, so that what companies and citizens pay internally for CO2 is also paid at the border. If it doesn't have the same price in the country of production. That's very complicated. It's not an easy thing to do. And I hope that maybe we can do it together with the new Biden administration to develop a common system, because it would also, of course, hit the US if we do introduce such a border adjustment mechanism. Mainly we think it with view of China, but it's also would concern the US. So I think it would be smart not to do it immediately against the US, but first try to do it maybe with the new Biden administration. But it's certainly necessary to have some adjustment mechanism at the border.
In fact, this is very much the question from Asia. So I'm going to bring him in now because I think he wants to ask about exactly this. So Asia, do you want to ask your question?
So my name is. Thanks for the presentation, Joe. My name is Asier Rodriguez from Spain. I studied a master's on renewable energies, but actually to the COVID-19 situation, I'm unemployed, but I'm trying to look at something in this sector. As I was listening to my fellow debaters, I was reading my question again, and I would like to rephrase it a little bit. To have been talking about the role model that should be the EU for other regions in the world regarding Europe environmental policies, renewable energies, and sustainability. Which kind of measures can we actually take them from Europe and export them into different regions of the world so as to engage them all into our policies, into our development, into our goals, so as to become sustainable and environmental friendly as a whole world, not just as European Union, because we have to, as well, gaining some kind of empowerment based from, thanks to Trump administration, actually, we're gaining some empowerment. How can we actually influence other regions of the world?
Very good question. Which part of Spain are you from?
In the Basque Country.
Ah, nice. To your question, you're absolutely right. Climate protection is an international challenge, and we as Europeans have a lot of responsibility and legal obligations to also help. If you take the current CO2 emissions, Europe without the EU, without the UK, is at 7%. So even if we go down to zero, there's still 93% out there. So it's obviously we have to make sure that we get others to also improve. And I think what are the roles of Germany, the EU in this? I think first of all, we have to show that, coming back to Ricardo's question, we can decouple growth and well-being from CO2 emissions. So that we have to prove it, and we have to invest for that in technologies. And the investments are high. There are different estimates from 180 billion a year to 250 billion a year that you need in order to get the technologies needed. And there are not so many countries or continents that can afford that. And I think that's our responsibility to do these investments, and then also transfer that technology to the global south. And we also need to help when it comes to adaptation and the transition in these countries. We have to invest much more because of our historical past, but also because it's in our own interest. So that's the cooperation question. And on many fronts, we can learn also from what other countries are already doing. So it's not that we have already all ready and we just need to export it. We also need to develop it, and we can learn from others. And then there can be partnerships. When we talk about green hydrogen power, there can be many good examples of cooperation with the North of Africa, with some countries. And I think there are great opportunities for that to come on equal footing and cooperate in this. And I think, together with President-elect Biden, it might be an opportunity to really build climate alliances, climate partnerships with many countries, with India, China, and have cooperation there. But it's clear that we need to invest a lot, and it's not cheap. But we have a responsibility there, and we really have to show it's possible. Because it's if every single country in this world goes the way we did, we are lost. So we have to be fast as well.
I have a question, if I may. So earlier you were talking about you made a point about tax and kind of social justice. Tax as a solution to climate change can raise issues of social justice, and of course this is something Macron discovered with the Gilets jaunes protests, for example. But then when it comes to the carbon border adjustment mechanism or the sort of carbon border tax, are there also issues of social justice in terms of some of the countries which might be worst affected by that? Could be some of the poorest countries in terms of trade. Is that also a consideration?
Basically it is about steel and cement. So by the categories, it doesn't hit so many countries. And it's difficult to enlarge it to many other sectors because then it becomes very administratively heavy and difficult to administer. So, I think probably talking first about these two sectors. There are some who think you could extend it to agriculture. That would hit many more countries, but that's extremely difficult to measure. So there we think, again, it would be easier to have joint agreements on not using glyphosate, or not using some technologies, and saying, if you consider going in this direction, we do support you and open up our markets, especially for you. So rather there to work with incentives, but it's a very interesting debate on which sectors exactly to take. And there, one consideration is the impact on developing countries, certainly. But again, I think, it's more about having joint cooperation and helping countries to go fast into a decarbonized economy, and to do this together.
Okay, Malta, you wanted to come in with a point.
Yes, it's kind of related, and also back to the framework that Franziska mentioned. So basically 3 columns of fostering innovation and having regulation, taxes, or carbon trade. So the thing is, you mentioned that sometimes you also need to forbid, you need to just ban some substances, and I completely agree, like toxic substances, in some points you want to forbid them and not be used anymore, but I feel like CO2 just doesn't fall into that category. So I think, at the current state, at least my view is that if you forbid it from one day to the other, like you did with ozone and depleting substances, for example, where we had the Montreal Protocol, whereas I think the industry or the global economy just wasn't built that much on emitting these kinds of substances compared to it is right now, and built on emitting CO2. What I'm saying is I'm agnostic to the means, like if it's a carbon tax or if it's a cap and trade system. What just interests me is that CO2 and other greenhouse gases go down. So I wonder if I understood you correctly, that CO2 is one of those substances that you consider that you would also want to forbid, and then yes, in which time frame?
No, not like in the end, if you want to be carbon free, like in substances, of course, not in terms of exhaling, you will never forbid it. So don't get me wrong. But of course we have, like you can set there so much CO2 per car, that's already what we have. So you can, you set a standard for how many emissions in each building. You set how many emissions in each shower, whatever, like we already have a set of laws that start with a still quite high level of CO2. And you can, of course, lower that, legally. And the advantage of lowering such standards, for example, is that you create innovation and competition. If you go by investments in the technologies, the state might be wrong and go in the wrong technologies or in the wrong companies. If you just said, this is the level playing field, that's what every company has to meet as a standard, the best ones will win. So that's also a balance between investing and setting a technological standard with lower CO2. And yes, in the end, we need to achieve, in many sectors like CO2 neutral processes. That's the goal. And that's where we have to go, but not in terms of, like that you can't breathe and I can't breathe, and, that you don't have dogs because they do breathe as well, not in that sense, but in terms of lowering the amount of CO2 allowed, for example, also per ton of steel or aluminium. So, these are via legal frameworks. And sometimes, it creates more competition and innovation.
Okay.
But yeah, we always say each of these different ways has advantages and disadvantages. And you just have to look, where can you counterbalance the disadvantages? Where can you best use the advantages? It's not that we say this is the only way or this is the only way, but you have to be smart in combining it.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Ricardo, you wanted to come in with a question?
Yes, let me know if it's still okay within the time frame.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah. It would be a simple question. Especially because you were referring a lot to that the objective is to decarbonize, to see if we can reduce our impact and so on and so forth, and especially taking into account international trade. So it's because this is a question that I've been asking myself for quite a bit. Like the global economy, the global trade has become so connected. In fact, it's been the subject of multiple books. Multiple books believe that that's why the economic collapse is inevitable, because we are so connected that that it might even be already too late to try to change the system per se. Because if you stop trading, like you said, if you try to reduce global trade to a level that it becomes carbon neutral, which is, well, by definition quite impossible, because you can't have boats that are carbon neutral, but minimizing it, then you would have to address the fact that the EU trades, at least in value, I believe, it imports almost as much as it exports food, I think. Last time I checked, it was something like that, but it's a huge amount. So we're talking about that even our food systems, they're completely dependent on international trade. So if we're talking about decarbonizing seriously, we're talking about stopping massively one of the systems that is arguably necessary for a basic indicator of well-being, which would be food or having enough to eat. So essentially, with all this messy context, my question is, wouldn't this require, as soon as possible, a bigger, very deliberate effort to reduce global trade?
Again, it depends on what, but you were asking about food, agriculture. Of course, the agricultural sector needs to reform, of course. I'm like, the way that we see rainforests burning so that we can have more soja to have more meat is not sustainable. but how do we want to approach it? We would like to combine it also, by the way, with animal protection and the way, animal wealth, and rather set standards there as well in terms of, what the animals are allowed to eat, how they're allowed to live, that they need some space, etc. So we want to go from a very extensive farming to a much less extensive farming. Intensive, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I mixed it up. I'm sorry. Intensive farming. So, of course, it will also impact of what we eat, when we eat, how much we eat. We just have to do it in a way that doesn't go just via pricing, for example. I think it would be wrong to go in the agricultural sector only by pricing. But there we really need to set standards.
Ricardo's question reminds me of the debate which is being had at the moment in Brussels around supply chains and European strategic autonomy, and the argument that you need to kind of shorten supply chains and focus on kind of more regional trade. I don't know if you have an opinion on that, Francesca.
I would. We have always we see that. For example, in agriculture, it makes perfect sense to have regional production and also consumption. And I think, for example, what makes perfectly sense is to invest much more in a circular economy so that you recycle rare earths, but many other, like, steel, whatever, so that we have all building cement. We do recycle very little. So we need to go much, much more into circular economy legally, like the Commission is hopefully going to do, but also by setting the circles that you need for that. And that will evidently lead to less imports, which also makes us more resilient because we don't rely on imports. So that dimension, I totally agree. Am I somebody who says, in general, it would be best if we do lower exports and imports? I really think it depends. I'm like, if we're going to export solar panels, it's good. If we do only import soya that has been produced by destroying rainforests, it's bad. And yes, there will be less if you go into a circular economy. And I don't know, probably we'll all travel less. We already do for the last couple of months. But I must say, I still would love to go back and see some friends in other parts of the world. I don't know how you feel. And that it has some value that we are interconnected and that we can travel and exchange and discover cultures and work together. And we can minimize a lot of that. But in the end, it doesn't replace human exchange. So we have to decarbonize, for example, also the airplane system, and yes, we have to fly less, but do we completely abandon and, never go and travel again? I hope we will be able to still exchange in a CO2-free way, less, but still possible.
Okay, that is an optimistic note, a more optimistic note.
In Europe, I'm very happy. By the way, if I'm allowed to say this, I've been fighting for the last couple of years to get European night trains back. And I've been fighting. I've made petitions and so many questions to our ministers. And for years, I always got no, Ms. Brandner, this is so old fashioned. We have fast cars and flights and we don't need night trains. And I was arguing, why not? It's so perfect. And yesterday, 2 days ago, the German Minister of Transport finally said, yes, we're going back into night trains. So for Europe, I think that's the best way to travel.
Okay, on that note, we are out of time. Thank you very much to everyone for taking part. Thank you for watching at home. You can continue debating this on our website, debatingeurope.eu. Thank you to our citizens panel. Thank you to Ricardo, Malta, and Asia. And thank you to Francesca Brandner for answering their questions. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for watching and stay safe over Christmas and have a good rest of 2020.